Number 2, you have to factor each polynomial and check your answer. So the greatest common factor is the very first thing you look for on any factoring problem. 10 and 3 have a greatest common factor of 1, but g cubed and g have a g in common. So my greatest common factor is a g, so I can pull out a g, which means I'm dividing each of these by g. So 10 divided by 1 is 10. G cubed divided by g to the first, you subtract 3 minus 1, you get g to the second. Then 3 divided by 1 is 3, and g divided by g is 1. 3 times 1 is just 3. So in factored form, that's as far as I can get. Between, on number 6, a 3, a 9, and a 3, my greatest common factor is a 3. They don't all have the same letter, so all I can do is divide out the 3. So if I divide each of those by 3, the 3's cross out, leaves me with x squared. Negative 9 divided by 3 is negative 3. Don't forget the x. And 3 divided by 3 is 1. Then between 14, 7, and 7, my greatest common factor is 7. They all have an n in common. The lowest exponent on any of the n's is n to the first, so I can actually pull out a 7n. So if I divide each one of these by a 7n, (14) divided by 7 is 2. N cubed divided by n, subtract 3 minus 1, you're going to get n squared. 7 divided by 7 is 1, and n divided by n is 1, so you're going to have plus 1. 7 divided by 7 is 1, and n squared divided by n, you do 2 minus 1, and you get an n. You factor by grouping when you have 4 terms. So I would group my first 2 terms, group my last 2 terms. My greatest common factor between x cubed and 4x squared, they have in common an x. The lowest exponent is x squared. So I'm going to divide both of those by x squared. So when I divide each of these by x squared, x cubed divided by x squared, 3 minus 2 is 1, so I get x to the first. 4 divided by 1 is 4. X squared divided by x squared cancels out, become a 1. 2 and 8, my greatest common factor is a 2. So I can divide out a 2. So if I divide each of those by 2, I end up with x plus 4. Then that's not factored because this plus sign in the middle is outside the parentheses. To be factored, all your plus and minus signs have to be inside parentheses. But what I notice is they have in common an x plus 4. So I can divide out the x plus 4. That's my greatest common factor. So when I cancel out the x plus 4's, I'm left with x squared plus 2. Number 17, 4 terms, means I can group. My greatest common factor between 4 and 6 is a 2. Between b cubed and b squared had the lowest exponent, so I'm going to divide out a 2b squared. So when I divide that out, 4 divided by 2 is 2. B cubed divided by b squared is b. Negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. And b squared divided by b cancels each other out. Then I have my plus sign. Greatest common factor between 10 and 15 is 5, so I can divide out a 5. So when I divide each of these by 5, 10 divided by 5 is 2. Don't forget the b. Negative 15 divided by 5 is negative 3. That's not factored because I have a plus sign outside parentheses. So what they have in common is a 2b minus 3. So I can divide each of these by 2b minus 3. And you always write your greatest common factor first in your factored form. So 2b minus 3. Cancel those out. And what I'm left with is 2b squared plus 5. And there are no common factors in either set of parentheses, so I know I'm completely factored because all my plus and minus signs are now inside parentheses. Number 19, group the first 2, group the last 2. My greatest common factor between 7r cubed and 35r squared would be 7, and then they have an r in common. You pick the lowest exponent, so 7r squared. So if I divide out a 7r squared, then 7 divided by 7 is 1. R cubed divided by r squared, 3 minus 2 is 1. Negative 35 divided by 7 is 5. The r squareds cancel each other out, become a 1, and 5 times 1 is still 5. Then I have a plus sign. Greatest common factor between 6 and 30 is 6. So I can divide each of those terms by 6. So that leaves me with 6r divided by 6 is 1r. Negative 30 divided by 6 is negative 5. That's not factored because the plus sign in the middle is outside parentheses. But what I notice is they have an r minus 5 in common. So I can divide out that r minus 5. So that's my greatest common factor. Those can cancel out, and that will leave me with 7r squared plus 6. And there are no common factors on either one of those. For number 21, I group the first two, group the last two. So my greatest common factor is 2r. 2r squared divided by 2r is an r. 6r divided by 2r is negative 3. Greatest common factor between 12 and 4 is 4. So if I divide out a 4, 12 divided by 4 is 3. 4r divided by 4 is r. So what I've got here is I've got opposites. So I can multiply the 4 by negative 1 and get negative 4. I can multiply 3 minus r by negative 1 and get r minus 3. So basically I multiplied this by negative 1, I multiplied the parentheses by negative 1, and a negative 1 times a negative 1 is positive 1, so I didn't change anything. So now what they have in common is r minus 3. What they don't have in common is 2r minus 4. Number 23, I can group the first two, can group the last two. Greatest common factor between 14 and 21 is 7. Between a q squared and a q is a q. So if I divide by 7q, I'm going to get 2q. 21q divided by 7q is a minus 3. Then I have a plus sign. Greatest common factor between 6 and 4q is 2. 6 divided by 2 is 3. Negative 4q divided by 2 is negative 2q. Once again, 2q minus 3 and 3 minus 2q are opposites. So I can multiply the 2 by a negative 1 and get a negative 2. I can multiply 3 minus 2q by negative 1 and get 2q minus 3. So what they have in common is 2q minus 3. What they don't have in common is 7q minus 2. Number 25, group the first two, group the last two. Greatest common factor between 2m cubed and 6m squared is a 2m squared. So 2m cubed divided by 2m squared is m. 6m squared divided by 2m squared is negative 3. Greatest common factor between 9 and 3 is 3, so I have plus 3. Then 9 divided by 3 is 3. 3m divided by 3 is going to be a negative m, which I have opposites again. So I can do 2m squared times m minus 3, and I can write that as a negative 3, and I can switch these around to m minus 3, and now they have an m minus 3 in common, and what they don't have in common is a 2m squared minus 3.